Well, following up on your claim that the positive sides of empire and the questions of contemporary rule, does the studies of historical empires offer us anything to, or for contemporary nation states, of how to actually run the show?
One would hope. It's a question I've thought a lot about, and I don't think historians have actually come to a good conclusion, but it has something to do with how an empire could create a discourse of unity around diversity. Because to my sense, in the modern day, that's what we need in the writing of the nation. And this, many of you got a notice yesterday from Liz saying that we were going to perhaps ask you questions. The reason that came up is in part because, you know, true disclosure, we're early modernists, and there are people amongst you who have tremendous expertise in this field. So I have an opinion on this topic, but I also want to lob a question out to Michael Hector, who has written 2 books on nationalism. And so I don't want to answer you now. I want you to think, have you answer now, but if you're willing, when we start questions, could you take the first one and give some thoughts about how a nation can constitute itself with a discourse, or in whatever, how, that encompasses instead of excludes. And my own feeling is that what you've got to do is to create a national story about yourself that somehow recognizes diversity instead of privileging the ethnic dominant class. It's extremely difficult to do because it's so easy to bifurcate and fissure into then all of those little identity groups that get recognized in the diversity. It's a very difficult task, but the nation, as its traditionally 19th century classic thought about nation, is it has a dominant ethnicity. That model does not work for the actual physical reality of most countries. So I'm thinking discourse. Michael might have some other responses, but let me lob a question to Johan and then get to your opinions. My question, I guess, is this fascinating topic of China as imperial model and as national model. So how you know, you're telling us that the Chinese are reviving their imperial heritage in order to define the modern-day nation-state. So what is the imperial legacy that they have, and how could they possibly forge it into a national story?
Well, that's pretty much the failure of the modern China nation-state. I mean, if you read the paper about Tibetan uprisings or uprisings in Xinjiang, these are kind of the inherent problems. And it's exactly that problem that China, the map, what you see on the map of China, the People's Republic of China, is the legacy of the Qing dynasty. And that what you see on the map was only created in the 18th century. But of course, this is exactly what the Chinese want to ignore. And so this was the basic problem with the rise of Chinese nationalism. I mean, the Chinese, the idea of the nation, ethnicity, and all of these ideas came into 19th century China from Japan during the time of the Meiji Restoration. And the Qing dynasty, which ruled from 1644 to 1911, was not Chinese. Again, it's important to understand, when we use this term Chinese in the West, what you're really talking about is one ethnic group, the largest ethnic group. Now they're 90% of the population in the PRC, but they are the Han Chinese. And then there are all of these other groups. There's the Mongols, there's the Tibetans, there's the Uyghurs, the Yi, the Ba, the Aklo, and all the rest of them. 56 recognized minority groups in China. And so when the revolution or the nationalist movement came in the 19th century, the Han Chinese took the idea that they are, Chinese nationalists, and they want to get rid of the Qing dynasty, which was a Manchu dynasty, non-Chinese. And so all of these nationalist discourses of creating a unified Han Chinese nation. And that's what it was about. And of course, the Tibetans did the same, and everybody else did the same. And then in 1911, when the revolution happened, we just celebrated, or they celebrated the 100th anniversary just last month. The Qing dynasty fell, and the Chinese nation was created. But of course, the Chinese didn't want to give up the territorial integrity of the dynasty. And so that's where all of these inherent problems come from. And one of the ways that the Chinese are dealing with this problem is by not talking about it. I work on the Qing dynasty, and unfortunately I can't work on Chinese history anymore because they have closed all the archives. All Chinese history, there's been a recent move in Chinese historiography called the New Qing history, which kind of looked at these imperial models and this kind of transition from empire to nation and how it was kind of erased. And there was a lot of work in this in the last 15 years. And in response to this, the Chinese government has closed all the Qing archives. So we can't work on those archives anymore. And so this is one of these, structural problems. I mean, and it's becoming very, very pervasive. I just, as an example of how kind of like crazy it's become, this was last weekend's New York Times book review. There was a review of a book by Tant Minh Yu, who's a noted historian of Burma, and he was looking at how Burma is going to interact between India and China, the two, rising powers of Asia. And it was a review by an American journalist who works on China and basically technology in China. And he talks, in Tant's book, he talks about how Burma used to have relations with southern China. In southern China, there used to be independent kingdoms. During the Tang Dynasty, there was the Nanjiao Kingdom, which was not Han Chinese. It was a native dynasty. And then that was replaced by the Dali Kingdom, which was eventually conquered by the Mongols. But this territory was eventually conquered by the Han Chinese in the 15th, 16th century. And what the American journalist tells this Burmese historian is, you shouldn't be writing about these other dynasties because you'll upset the Chinese. You can't talk about Chinese history, that there were dynasties within Chinese history that were not Chinese. So this is at the level that it's become. It's like anything you talk about Chinese history, you're marked as a splittist. And you can't challenge any notion that this territorial integrity that was created in the 18th century doesn't go back 5,000 years into the past.
I have to respond a little bit just to say that the Russian case is so similar in a sense that I've lived recently in Moscow for a quarter, and I was struck there at how clueless they seem to be about the fact that Russia is a Russian federation with, 22 autonomous ethnic republics as part of the organization of the state. All of the discussion in Russia now is, what does it mean to be Russian? And the messages coming out of the Kremlin tend to be strongly Russian nationalist, as if there are no other ethnic peoples in the huge realm, which is the legacy of the old Russian Empire that they inherited after 1991. So that there is this blithe amongst the places that still have this huge imperial heritage. There seems to be a blithe attempt to just wish unitary nationalism into shape in both of the two places that are most like this, although I imagine there are many other countries around the world that also have similar diversity. So, yeah. So can I impose on Michael to say a few words? The author of 2 books on nationalism?
I really liked your presentation of the issues that were involved in the study of empires. And it seems to me that if we're going to talk, and I agree with you, that this issue of diversity within unity and diversity is a key issue politically all over the world, in part because of globalization, of course, and rapidly increasing immigration everywhere. I think we have to make a distinction between 2 different types of diversity. The first one is diversity of the sort that you find in China and even in the United States to some extent, where you have a distinctive cultural group that's located in a particular territory. Mm-hmm. Think of Quebec in Canada, or maybe what used to be the South in the United States, a distinctive region with its own distinctive interests, ideology, culture to some degree. And then there's the diversity that's involved in as a function of immigration patterns. So the United States has both of these things, historically, both of them. China, mostly territorial kinds of distinctions to a large extent. Europe now, Western Europe, immigration. And it seems to me that the solutions to those problems are somewhat different because the problems are different. In the immigration case, I'm sure that a multicultural kind of ideology or discourse of the kind that we have in the United States, for instance, the melting pot of ethnic groups, is a help. Of course, also the institutions that might promote the integration of these immigrant groups as they come in are obviously important. And I think there's some evidence, I think, that Canada's done even a better job of integrating its immigrants than the United States has. And Europe falls short of that with its kind of fortress Europe kind of mentality, that there's a state church and a particular ideology that's connected to a particular ethnic group in most of the Western European countries. With respect to the territorial diversity issue, the classical answer for that has always sort of been federalism, which is, of course, part of the DNA of the United States as well. And the problem with federalism simply is that it can only work if the center has enough resources to make these distinctive federal units, subunits, want to stay loyal and connected to the center. So that in Yugoslavia, for instance, which fell apart, one of the reasons that Yugoslavia fell apart was that the center could not hold and could not make it essentially profitable for Slovenia and Croatia and the other kinds of republics to stick with the center, especially after it lost so many resources because of the end of the Cold War. Because Tito had done a brilliant job of corralling resources from the United States to keep Yugoslavia independent from the Warsaw Pact. So the issue about federalism is that it can only work where there's a strong center and where there's a lot of economic development. And that's hard to do in places like, for instance, like Iraq, where some people have proposed a federal solution to the problems in Iraq, the diversity problems. Well, I think I've said enough.